I actually am ashamed of a lot of my compatriots in Silicon Valley. There's a lot of people who are sitting there saying, wow, I'm going to disrupt XYZ without giving any thought to the consequences. And actually, I think so many of them are not even real entrepreneurs, quite honestly.
Are you ready? All right, let's go.
Manufacturing is sexy. Sounds crazy? Just wait. I'm Z Holly, host of The Art of Manufacturing. Your behind-the-scenes look at how people who make stuff are trying to make it in their industries. If you've ever wondered how to build a brand, a business, or just a better mousetrap, tune in and enjoy. As an entrepreneur, I feel like I go through phases. Between startups, I'm always meeting new people. I have my feelers out for new trends and exciting technologies. But when I'm in the thick of things, it's all about the hustle and the execution. It can be hard to lift my eyes up for 1 second. But technology is changing the world so fast, and we all ignore these trends at our peril. I had the real pleasure of interviewing my friend and futurist Tim O'Reilly recently, and I wanted to share the conversation with all of you. Unless you're in Silicon Valley circles, you might not have heard Tim's name before, but you know his work. He popularized terms like open source and Web 2.0. And as an early evangelist for the maker movement, he and his firm O'Reilly Media started Make Magazine and Maker Faire. And he's been an early champion of the Internet of Things. Going way back, he wrote about the World Wide Web before most of us ever heard about it back in 1994. In fact, I remember my personal copy of the World Internet Users Guide, which listed the websites across the internet, all about 200 of them. Yep, that was a long time ago. It's no surprise he's been called the Oracle of Silicon Valley. We recorded this conversation live at Cross Campus in downtown LA as part of the Live Talks business series. And I was curious, given his superpowers in identifying trends, where he thinks technology is going today, and how it will impact the future of work and business. We talk about his book, WTF, What's the Future? And his contrarian thoughts about the role of capitalism in Silicon Valley. He also quotes tons of other books, and we include links in the show notes. I asked him how to predict the future, and he tells me that's the wrong question. But he gives us excellent tips for identifying trends and some really provocative ideas about our role as entrepreneurs in developing a just and abundant world for everyone. We hear about that and a whole lot more on this week's episode of The Art of Manufacturing.
I want to start with asking you about your favorite prediction and how you made that prediction, because I'd like to get a little bit of a better sense for everybody of that process of creating that map and understanding what the future is going to be like.
Well, first thing I would say is that I don't actually predict the future. All I've ever done is notice things about the present and then tell a story about them in a way that helped other people to see them. So when we published that first book about the internet in 1992, we noticed that the World Wide Web was really interesting. It was actually my colleague Dale Doherty who basically said, hey, there's this thing, the World Wide Web, you got to meet this guy, Tim Berners-Lee. And the editor wrote the chapter about the World Wide Web and shoehorned it into the book at the last minute because we said this is really important. But it was just like, wow, we believe in this. And the reason we believed in it was that we had been trying to do things like the web. We were trying to figure out what would online publishing look like in a way that was open, that was interoperable. And then along came the web. And we came at it from actually looking at how to do ebooks. Mm-hmm. And then we said, wow, this is the publishing medium of the future. So in some sense, we were just recognizing what we were looking for. So, one of the statements that I didn't make, by the way, I'm really very fond of using other people's words whenever possible. Oscar Wilde once said, quotation is a reasonable substitute for wit. But basically, William Gibson, the science fiction writer, once I heard him on the radio, and he said, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed yet. And I've tried to live by that, and I've actually kind of recirculated that quote so often, I think it might have been forgotten, but for the fact that I picked it up. But, there are people living at any point in the future. So a lot of what I try to do is to tell a story about the things that I'm seeing today And there is sort of a sense of sort of a direction towards the future. Something lodges in my head, and it's often somebody says something, probably when I think back, maybe the very beginning for me of the notion that data was going to be more important than software was from, it was some random talk, and he said, people talk all the time about Moore's Law, but storage is getting cheaper faster than computing is getting faster. And it just sort of lodged in my head. And it's a little bit like, if you have the right kind of mental attitude, you let curious things become snags in the river of your mind. You think how you see a river and there's an old tree stump and all this stuff starts to gather on it. And it's a little bit like that. So here's this idea, and it starts to accrete, and more things accrete around it. And then you go, oh, that's actually starting to talk to me. So part of the gift of seeing the future is to notice things that seem slightly anomalous and interesting that you don't actually know how to make sense of, and being able to hold them in a kind of a light way so that they still hang out in your head, but you don't try to force them into a story or a map prematurely.
Do you consider yourself a patient person?
No, I think of myself probably as an impatient person, but I know in this regard at least, I do practice a certain kind of intentional patience. One of my favorite authors is Lao Tzu, the Chinese philosopher, and there's this wonderful stanzas about the qualities of the wise man. Sometimes there's nothing to do but wait until the stream clears. And I think that is that experience of, there's something there. Can you sit with it long enough for it to speak to you, for all the pieces to arrive on the table, and for the pattern to emerge? So, when I think about what I've done over the years, a lot of times it's just sitting with things that don't quite fit until they fall into place, and I go, oh, now it makes sense.
So maybe it's a lesson for entrepreneurs to learn. I know that a lot of times when I've coached entrepreneurs and they go in to pitch an idea, they think it's all about trying to convince the other person to buy their idea, when in fact it's an opportunity to get the feedback and explore and find that product market fit. So it almost feels like you're constantly in that mode.
Oh, absolutely. So the whole process, for example, of the ideas that are in this book, WTF and What's the Future and Why It's Up to Us, there's actually a set of things. Let me just kind of give a brief outline of the book. The first part of the book is called How to Think About the Future, and it's really a little bit about these ideas that I was just talking about, although put in the context of some of these historical events like open source software and Web 2.0 and how I saw those things. The second part of the book is really about today's platforms and what we learn from thinking about those platforms. The third is really the ways that our world is increasingly ruled by algorithmic systems. Think about Facebook and its influence on the world, or Google, and ultimately I get to financial markets. And then the fourth part of the book is the It's Up to Us part of the book. This is what's the role of human choice and how do we shape these things that we're building. A lot of it is really just being able to hold a lot of stuff in your head, being comfortable with a lot of uncertainty, and basically pursuing that clarity gradually and humbly and inquiringly. Because I started the process maybe 3 or 4 years ago with something I called the Next Economy Summit, where I'm trying to understand what is it that's wrong with the economy and what does technology teach us about it? And it's a process of inquiry. And, finishing the book, I'm actually now much clearer about a bunch of the ideas, and I have a whole lot of things that I want to work on now about platform economics, for example. How do we understand, using Google and Facebook as examples of economies? Can we actually learn things about the broader economy and principles about platform economics and who gets what and why? And I've got a whole set of new questions that I'm asking.
So what are those questions?
Well, when you look at our broader economy, everybody's sort of questioning the rise of inequality, increased negative problems in our economy. And to me, there's a bad map at the heart of that. And the bad map is that the economy is somehow a natural phenomenon. Technology just wants to eliminate jobs. Companies, of course, are naturally going to try to find the lowest possible costs, which means getting rid of people whenever possible, outsourcing to the lowest labor costs, all these kinds of things. And I've come to believe that, first of all, in general, that's the wrong map. But very specifically, that what technology platforms teach us is about you design a market. When you look at what, say, Uber and Lyft are doing, they are designing markets. They're trying to figure out what's the right set of incentives to get enough drivers to show up and enough passengers to show up.
And you talked about that in the book too, about how they're making certain choices.
That's right.
Where you can be advantaging the customer or the driver or, all
exactly.
sorts of,
And it was actually Jonathan Hall, who's the chief economist at Uber, who handed me, or he didn't hand me this book, he pointed me to a book called Who Gets What and Why by a guy named Alvin Roth, a Nobel Prize winning economist. What he got his prize for was for the design of kidney transplant marketplaces. He basically figured out a different way of matching up donors and recipients that actually has much, much higher yield, saving, many, many lives. And it really gets across this idea. Actually, this is another economist, Mariana Mazzucato, who said markets are outcomes. And this idea that we design markets, and the fact that here, Alvin Ross could redesign the matching algorithm for kidney transplants and save all these lives, that reminds us so powerfully that the design of marketplaces has an impact. And of course, then you go look, well, what did Hal Varian do at Google? Well, he applied economics to design and to help design the Google ad matching marketplace. And it worked better than the one that Overture had designed, which in turn worked better than the one that, the old broadcast model. So here's a very clear illustration of this idea that markets are outcomes. And I'm kind of going, well, if we can see that at Google, can we see it in the broader economy?
Well, something happened in 1972. There was this inflection point where all of a sudden, what used to be that the growth of the economy and the growth of wages were growing in lockstep. And then something happened. That's when that gap started. What happened and why? Some people complain about that's when automation started. Was it Milton Friedman? Was it?
In a complex system, you can't assign a single cause. But I think it's very meaningful that starting in the 1970s is when this idea of shareholder primacy took over in our markets. And it's actually a really interesting little piece of history. It was in 1970, Milton Friedman wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, which was called "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits." And the idea was, when a company takes on social causes, that it actually is usurping the rights of its owners. It should just give the money back to its owners and let them decide what they wanted to spend the money on. Now that's good in theory. It turns out in practice that op-ed was part of an offensive against Ralph Nader and the idea that cars should be made safer and more fuel efficient. You look at that and you go, actually, the market was trying to tell the world something that was important. And in fact, this was an intervention to keep that from happening. So it's kind of ironic. But anyway, then this guy named Michael Jensen came along and started preaching this idea of shareholder primacy. And in particular, and this really comes to this idea of markets are outcomes. The idea was we actually need to align CEO pay with the goals of shareholders. That is, pay top management in stock, and they will, of course, want to increase the value of the stock. And that's really the original sin of the modern economy. That's when we switched from what we now think of as this special kind of company that basically takes into account social values, employees, communities, all these things that companies used to think that they ought to care about. And we told companies, no, don't care about that anymore. In fact, we'll incentivize you not to care about it.
Yeah, so it's almost as though we've reprogrammed the algorithm for our market.
So that's kind of what I'm trying to do, is use this notion that you can see that Facebook, for example, has this algorithm that said, optimize for engagement. Show people more of what they like. Show them more of what they share. Show them more of what they comment on. And Facebook told themselves, this will be really good. It will build us a great advertising business. It will increase people's connection with their friends. And then we discovered that it increased hyperpartisanship, that it led to incentives for spammers. And now we're expecting Facebook to fix their algorithms and go, oh, you didn't do what you thought you were going to do. It's a wonderful quote. For those of you who are in the tech industry, you'll really, I think, get this. It's a quote from a friend of mine in the early days of Macintosh programming said to me something. He said, the skill of debugging is to figure out what you really told your program to do instead of what you thought you told your program to do. And that's what Facebook is doing right now. They're trying to figure out what did they really tell their program to, their algorithmic systems to do instead of what they thought they told it to do. And I think that's the broader question that I want to ask about the economy. When Milton Friedman or when Michael Jensen were talking about this idea of shareholder primacy, they thought it'll make the economy more efficient. It'll solve this problem they call the agency problem, where company management might be incented to look after themselves. But they actually created a different problem. And just as we expect Facebook to debug their system and figure out what they really told it to do, we need to start figuring out what we really told our economy to do.
Although it's probably easier to reprogram the algorithm to favor greed than it is to program it back.
Yeah, I think that's actually really true. And that's something that actually brings up a wonderful piece of business advice from Jeff Bezos. He apparently he talked about one-way and two-way decisions. You want to make two-way decisions very quickly. If you can do something and you can back out of it, that's a two-way decision. But if it's a one-way decision, a really big one that's hard to back out of, you need to be much more thoughtful about it. Again, that's one of those useful little maps that you kind of go, oh, okay, now that I have that concept, that tool for thinking, I can always ask myself, wait, is this an easy out? Can I just reverse this decision if I'm wrong? Great, then let's do it. Let's do it quickly. Let's authorize people, in the Mark Zuckerberg line, move fast and break things. But if it's a one-way decision, that is, once you've made this, is very hard to back out, you got to be a hell of a lot more careful.
I want to take a turn to opportunities that are being unlocked by technology now. So one of the cool things that you get to do is surround yourself with the most amazing people, and that's, I think, why you've been able to see things. Your convenings, Foo Camp, amazing, just amazing people who go. What are you seeing on the horizon, the short-term horizon, that you think are opportunities that people might not be aware of, that would be great opportunities for business to know about?
I guess the first thing I would say is, for the broader business world, I think the biggest and most important shift is to realize that automation is not for doing the same thing more cheaply. You think back to the first industrial revolution or the agricultural revolution. I'm from Ireland. They used to eat potatoes and cabbage, and that was pretty much it, and they get occasional lamb, right? When we had the agricultural revolution, we went here in the U.S. from 80%, actually, no, it was 60% of the population working in 1900, still on the land, down to 2%. We didn't say, great, we got the potatoes and cabbage thing down, you all get them much more cheaply, we're done. Think about the incredible cornucopia of food that we all get to enjoy. We basically did more with the technology. We didn't say, great, you got your one suit, and then your Sunday suit, and you're good. Now everybody has, dozens.
Is that a good or a bad
more.
thing?
Well, I don't know if it's maybe it's got some untoward consequences, but we're all richer in clothing than the richest people 200 years ago. A modern day example of that, I see Amazon putting robots into their warehouses. And they put 45,000 robots in between 2014 and 2016. They added 250,000 people. They didn't say, oh, wow, we can get rid of all our warehouse workers and use robots. They said, wow, if we have robots plus people, we can actually get more products to people next day. We can pack more products in the warehouse, get them out faster. A lot of zip codes, we can get products to people the same day. So they upped the ante. They did more. And I look at that as the tremendous opportunity of technology. Uber and Lyft, they deliver more taxi service than taxi companies. They didn't just say, wow, we can actually just deliver the same level of crappy service more cheaply. And yet that is so often the narrative. I talked to one investor who said, wow, I've invested in a startup that will get rid of 30% of call center jobs. And I go, Why would you want to do that? Call centers suck. Why aren't you looking at how we use AI to make them better? And I think that the company that does figure out how to use AI to make them better is actually going to be more successful. And that's why, Jeff and Elon are so successful, because they're kind of going, how do we up the ante with this stuff?
So you sound like a real optimist about the technologies. And
I'm an optimist about the choices that we can make. Not about, it's like it's inevitable that technology will be better.
That's a really important distinction.
Yeah.
Now, are you, some people that don't live in Silicon Valley or are not in tech, in other places in the country may say, okay, this Tim O'Reilly guy, he's in Silicon Valley, he's, has all the tech at his fingertips, he sees all his friends getting super rich on all these technologies, it's all great for him and his buddies, what's it going to mean for everybody else? So how do you actually reconcile?
I actually am ashamed of a lot of my compatriots in Silicon Valley. There's a lot of people who are sitting there saying, wow, I'm going to disrupt XYZ without giving any thought to the consequences. And actually, I think so many of them are not even real entrepreneurs, quite honestly. I've actually come to this, just one of my little sort of observations. A serial entrepreneur is a lot more like an actor or a director or a producer going around hat in hand to movie studios trying to get their movie funded. And you go, yes, that's a kind of entrepreneurial activity, but it's not the same kind of entrepreneurial activity of somebody who's saying, I have this idea, I'm wedded to it, I'm going to build this thing, I really care about it. It's just like building a product that you think you can sell to a studio, and it's kind of this little short-term
And it's
gig.
almost like your success is measured by how much money you raise, or that the valuation of your company on
again,
paper.
Total bad map. You talk to people, well, what have you accomplished? And they go, well, I raised XYZ. And I go, what does that matter? You know how much I raised? Zero. I've been just doing.
And your company makes hundreds of millions a year, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and I started the company with $500, and I made products that people want, and I sold them to them. That's what I do. That's an old-fashioned business, and I think there's so many people where the product is the ability to get an investor. And I look at that and I go, that's what a bunch of people on Wall Street were doing in 2006. Hey, can we get somebody to buy this sucker? Great. And when I say somebody buy, somebody in the financial markets to buy it, not real customers. And I think we need to understand that we're in this pretty bubbly period of tech, and great stuff is happening, and there is a whole side of bubbles are part of the mix. But I think John Maynard Keynes said, a little frothiness is okay, but when the bubbles are the bulk of the economic activity, we're in for trouble. And I think we've been in an era where so much of what we call investment isn't really investment, it's gambling.
You're listening to The Art of Manufacturing. Follow our adventures on Instagram and Twitter @ArtofMFG. And to chat with other like-minded creators, join the Art of Manufacturing Facebook group. We'll be right back after this break. The Art of Manufacturing podcast is a collaboration with Make It in LA, which is generously supported by organizations like the LA Cleantech Incubator. LACI has a really cool facility in the Arts District of downtown LA filled with energetic startups and nonprofits. They offer cleantech startups flexible office space, epic prototyping labs, and the #1 rated cleantech incubation program in the world. Learn more at makeitinla.org/LACI. We're speaking with Tim O'Reilly, futurist and the author of WTF, What's the Future?
A lot of people think that tech means digital, but I think that you were one of the first, and O'Reilly Media was one of the first to really see the opportunity in applying tech to the physical world and the way it's changing. Just the way, a lot of trends, whether it's the maker movement, starting Make Media and Maker Faire, Internet of Things, swapping out physical with digital, all that. So I'm curious, what do you see as the opportunities and the big shifts that are coming for manufacturing companies?
Well, probably the biggest thing that's happening right now is that the physical and the digital are interpenetrating in new ways. We're just at the beginning of a new paradigm of really intelligent, magical objects. So the maker movement was certainly part of that. You kind of go, wow, we're sort of weaving electronics into things. I once described the maker movement as smart stuff and dumb stuff made with smart tools. And
I like the maker movement better.
No, I but this sort of idea that there really are two parts is we're building this set of literally things that are becoming more intelligent, and we're also building smarter tools for affecting the physical world. They're the two halves of the maker movement.
Right.
And so what that means is two things. It does mean manufacturing, but it really means thinking about how are we going to restructure workflows in the real world. Examples that people wouldn't think of as Internet of Things plays. I look at, one is the Apple Store. She's like, okay, what if we use the smartphone instead of the cash register as the organizing tool for the workflow of a retail environment? How would we do it differently? And Apple basically completely rethought retail, made the most successful stores in the world by giving every person's smartphone superpowers, creating a new way of interacting with customers in the real world. Think about what Uber and Lyft did with the smartphone and summoning cars. Again, this was a realization of the capabilities of ubiquitous sensors in the hands of drivers and passengers in the real world. And I go, well, let's keep thinking along those lines. And you say, well, as we make these tools more intelligent, and then you go, well, the opportunity is not in making the stuff. It's actually in thinking about what would you do differently once you had the stuff. And so a good example, and again, this fits back with the William Gibson, The Future is Here. You look at a company like Zipline, which is working in Africa, starting in Rwanda, delivering blood and medicine by drone on demand. One of the leading causes of death in Rwanda is postpartum hemorrhage in women. They don't have developed hospital infrastructure. They have bad roads. If you don't have, a big repository of all the different blood types, people die. They can get blood on demand anywhere in the country in 25 minutes with drones. So here's this sort of combination of, what was maker technology, but it's like, wait a minute. Why do we have to do it the old way where we build these big hospital facilities and all this infrastructure? They can jump right over that. It's going to be all these new capabilities of smart stuff, or dumb stuff made with smart tools that will allow us to restructure the way we do business. And there's so many industries that have this tremendous inertia. When I imagine like one of the jobs of the future, it's in healthcare. What do we know from big data? We know that healthcare hotspotting is actually an incredible way to save cost. If you can identify a high usage patient and intervene before they go to the emergency room, you can actually save a huge amount of money. There are people, a very small number of people who create a very large percentage of the healthcare costs in this country. And many of them are what they, like emergency room frequent flyers, people who go to the emergency room 3-4 times a week, right? And they could actually have an on-call personal healthcare worker for less than what they're costing the system today. And you go, wow, we could identify those people. You could have community health workers with the equivalent, whether it's a smartphone app or the equivalent of Google Glass, who are able to be in touch with a doctor if they need additional help. They're effectively upskilled in the same way that an Uber driver is upskilled by their devices so they can actually handle more situations, be more capable. They're also on call, on demand. Maybe they're dispatched by algorithm. Mr. Smith hasn't taken his medicine today. Go knock on his door. That's all possible. And it would be a completely different way of thinking about healthcare. And I think we'll actually get there. And I would bet that there are startups working on that today.
I want to talk a little bit about LA, because LA is a unique beast, different from, it definitely has a very vibrant tech economy and culture, but I think that as a city, we're actually mostly manufacturing. We have 4 times as many jobs in manufacturing as in film and television.
That's awesome.
Which is crazy. We are mostly small businesses. We only have one Fortune 100 company, Disney. Compare that to Silicon Valley, it's just completely different, right? So a lot of different dynamics. Lots of creatives and a big kind of gig economy as well. And so I wonder how these technologies are going to be impacting Los Angeles and how LA could actually take advantage of these trends as well.
Well, I mean, in some sense, maybe the point that you're making is that LA is taking advantage of these trends, and that LA is a model for the economy of the future. I have to say, I do think that this Silicon Valley focus, that success means a hyperscale platform that gets 1 billion users, and sorry, you were in the lottery and you didn't make it, it's not a very good economy, frankly. Right now it looks good because, effectively you get paid to have your ticket to the lottery, as opposed to you have to pay. Eventually, somebody pays. Most of those investors will lose their money. And I think we really need an economy that looks a lot more like LA's. And we need to actually understand that it is actually smaller businesses and more diverse businesses and a wider range of businesses that mark a good economy. And then ask ourselves, okay, when we build these hyperscale platforms, are they enabling that? And that is, one of the really interesting questions for me, kind of going back to that idea of how do we build platforms that become supports for a rich infrastructure of smaller businesses. Again, I think if we had the economy of LA all across this country, we'd be pretty happy. And I think your point about being manufacturing is super important. Aerospace is a big part of it. And you do see things like the fact that Elon Musk has kind of reignited this enthusiasm for space.
We had this job fair that Mayor Garcetti had hosted, and I don't know, I think it must have been 60 tech companies, and by far the longest lines of people waiting and excited about the jobs were Hyperloop One and SpaceX, definitely.
Yeah, and it really does show that one of the incredible roles that entrepreneurs should be playing is to inspire people to believe in a better future. And that's really a key idea in the book. A lot of people ask me, well, who is this we? Why is it up to us? What do you mean? What can we do? And the thing that I think is so important is change happens because people believe in something different. They believe that something different is possible. There was a time when most of the people in the Western world, at least, believed in the divine right of kings. And a whole bunch of people here in America, and then not too much later in France, and actually it turns out in Russia about the same time, although they got put down by Catherine the Great, all came along and said, no, we don't believe that anymore. We don't want to play that game. And when the early colonies succeeded in breaking away from England, George III, the King of England, expected that George Washington would be crowned king in America. And when Washington went back to his farm, George III said, if he has truly done that, he is the greatest man the world has ever seen. It was unthinkable. It was utterly unthinkable that there would not be a king. And we basically started trying to figure out how to make a different kind of country, right? And, it's not perfect. We're still struggling with it, but it began with a set of people believing that something different was possible. And I think that's what entrepreneurs do. A great entrepreneur says, the way the world works today is not the end and the only way it could work. I have a better idea. And I think we need a better idea about how to build an equitable economy, an economy that works for everyone. And it starts by believing that the economy we have is not inevitable, that it's the result of a set of choices that we make, and that we can make better choices.
Really, it reminds me of John Seely Brown writing about how surfers would watch, once YouTube came out and kids were putting videos of themselves surfing online, and the same thing happens with skating. All of a sudden, everyone started doing it because they believed that it actually could happen.
Well, or a famous one with Roger Bannister in the 4-Minute Mile. As
Exactly.
soon as you believe that something is possible. And I think that we have to tell ourselves, if we want to build a better world, we have to get rid of the narrative that says, no, this is as good as it gets.
I want to ask one more question before we throw it out to the audience. You have this quote that I just love, and I don't feel like it's caught on as much as a lot of the other things that you've promoted, is the idea of creating more than you capture. Do you feel like it's taken off as much as it has?
Whether or not that particular phrasing or that idea has taken off, it's the truth, that is, systems that work have that characteristic. If you're growing a garden and you take out more than you put back into the soil, you don't get as much the next year round. And, I observe this in computer platforms. You basically, as the platform owner, take too much out. Eventually, people go somewhere else. It's what happened to Microsoft. I think it's happening to Google today. I think that companies have to learn that lesson. So whether or not the phrase has caught on, it's certainly been a useful principle for us at O'Reilly. We really use it as a touchstone in our thinking. But, it is the truth. Our economy right now falters because companies, they turn extractive. And there's some really good books on this. Luigi Zingales and James Robinson wrote a book called, Why Nations Fail. And it's basically about inclusive versus extractive economies. And extractive economies end up being less stable and less long-lasting. And I think, we just have to get that is, in fact, a reasonably close approximation to a useful and powerful truth.
Love it. So let's take some questions.
So it's that time where questions at Live Talks LA. Just a quick reminder, they typically start with a W or an H, sometimes a D. They are generally short. There is no such thing as a two-part question. And only Z gets to ask the follow-up questions.
Thank you very much for great conversation. You've talked around regulation and taxation. The market is a public good. Should the market be designed in the labs of Facebook, or should it be a public process?
You mentioned the word taxation. I think that our system of taxation is one of the fundamental design tools of our economy that we sort of take for granted as sort of, well, it's just the way it works. But in fact, we have a lower tax rate on capital gains, even though capital is abundant and we no longer need to be optimizing for capital creation. There's a lot of people who have a lot of it and they're not actually deploying it very well, and we're creating a lot of tax policies that let them accumulate more of it and not deploy it. Meanwhile, ordinary people don't have enough money to spend. In economist speak, it's the growth is slower because of, quote, lack of aggregate demand. What that means is people don't have the money to spend. And you go, well, why wouldn't our tax policy go, well, let's actually reduce the taxes on ordinary people and raise it on people who have a lot of capital. And of course, because there's a self-serving narrative that says, well, those who have the capital should get more of it, and we're going to pay you, Congress, if you will give us what we want. So tax policy absolutely needs to change. Oh, regulation. The thing that I would say about regulation, and I have a chapter on that in the book, there's a lot of lessons from technology about how to do regulation right. Because, of course, our big tech platforms are regulatory systems. All of our email goes through a regulatory system that decides that some things are spam and some things aren't. Credit card system is a regulatory system, a very clever one, in fact. Government made this really smart regulatory intervention that said, hey, credit card companies, the consumer is not liable for fraud. It's your problem. And you go, wow, all of a sudden they have to actually actively work to regulate fraud. Putting the shoe on the right foot is often the, probably the most important thing that government should do, rather than kind of going, well, we're going to try to chase down all the malefactors. The thing that you learn the most from regulatory systems like, say, Google search quality is that it's a constant battle. And yet, government tends to say, well, here's a set of big pile of rules. We did that. We'll have another rule making 10 years from now. In the meantime, we won't really bother measuring whether the rules worked or not. Versus that constant A/B testing that you see in tech companies. And a really interesting question is, could government programs be continually testing to see, hey, did we achieve the objective that we thought we were trying to achieve?
I have one more question around policy. The idea of universal basic income has really caught hold, I think mostly a lot in Silicon Valley too, which is surprising given the libertarian leanings. Yeah. What do you think about it?
I'm mixed about the idea. It brings to mind this wonderful line from T.S. Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral, where he said, this last temptation is the greatest treason, to do the right deed for the wrong reason. The idea of UBI has caught on largely because there's this idea that the robots are going to take all the jobs and there won't be any jobs for ordinary people. And I go, well, that's just wrong. We don't have jobs. Look around. There's a lot of work to be done, and we're just not doing it. And we're not asking ourselves why. What's wrong with our economy that we're not putting people to work doing the things that need doing? I mean, if the economy was working correctly, we would be building cities for refugees. We wouldn't be kind of having them in squalid camps. If the economy was working correctly, we would be rebuilding tumble-down districts. We would be figuring out how to put people to work.
There are plenty of problems to solve.
There's plenty of work to be done.
Yeah.
That being said, I do believe that we basically aren't taking the fruits of productivity and giving it enough to people. And so, yes, should we take the fruits of this incredible machine productivity, which has created so much wealth, and distribute it better? Absolutely. Basic income might be the best mechanism for that, and it's all in the math. It might be a negative income tax, but it also could be something like, well, let's just reduce working hours. Let's give people an allowance for ongoing continuing education so they can get new skills. We have to do some experimentation to see which would work best. The idea that, well, this is a popular idea, so therefore we should do it, doesn't, to me, meet the test. I would go, well, would we rather reduce working hours so that we put more people to work? That's what we've done in the past very successfully. We took kids out of the workforce and sent them to school, and that raised wages for everybody else. And that was a pretty good strategy. We've done that 2 or 3 times.
Should we have not put women in the workforce?
What would have been really good is if we'd put more women in the workforce and taken more men out, and so that they did the family work, which is real work also.
Yes. And we don't actually
of
measure
course,
that.
It's just work that we don't pay for. There's so much real important work that we just say, yeah, we don't pay for that. And of course, it doesn't get done. And they go, if we're going to have an economic system, let's get it to include all the work, not just, stuff that used to be men's work.
You've talked about these technologies that are behemoths of Google, Amazon, Uber. Could you speak of any companies that you think are on the breakthrough of disruptive technology that have unrealized potential?
If we look out, 10, 15 years, I don't think that any of the companies that we think of today will be the darlings of industry.
Which entrepreneurs and innovators do you admire the most for their potential to take us in the right direction?
Well, I admire different people for different reasons. One of the entrepreneurs I admire most is a guy named Todd Park. He was a co-founder of Athena Health and then Castlight Health, and then he became the Chief Technology Officer of the United States. Basically, I think of him because he's somebody who is working tirelessly to make the world a better place. Todd is there. Give me a hard problem that I'm going to work on for a long time, and I love that. I think Elon Musk has a lot of that in him. And here's this thing, space travel or, energy transformation I really believe in. And he puts his own money at work. I mean, this is a guy who believes in what he's going after. I'm also a big admirer of Jeff Bezos. I mean, incredibly foresighted, basically has built this incredible engine single-mindedly. I struggle a little bit with some of the ruthless aspects of Amazon.
Making life very hard for many other entrepreneurs.
But I do think that, if I look at somebody who's playing the long game, you have to admire Jeff, and he's certainly, one of the greatest entrepreneurs of the internet.
So what would be the one call to action that you're leaving with everybody here?
Well, I say it a lot, work on stuff that matters. And I don't mean just work on do-gooder stuff. I just look around and find things that make the world better than you found it. And that can be a little thing or a big thing. But that is our obligation, all of us, every day in our lives, to leave the world better than we found it.
How can people find you online?
I'm at Tim O'Reilly on Twitter. I have a webpage for the book at WTFeconomy.com. My company is O'Reilly.com. We're an online learning company. I have a Next Economy newsletter. Again, if you just Google for that, you'll find it. I think that's probably a pretty good list. And actually, I have to say, making stuff is amazing, and everybody is a maker. It's really just realizing that the world is something that we make.
Well, thank you so much for bringing your wisdom to us and the great stories and a lot to think about.
Oh, thank you.
So much great stuff. But I think the three most provocative things I learned were, first, you can't predict the future. It's kind of surprising to hear from a futurist. But you can identify trends and help bring them to fruition. The real light bulb for me was that being a futurist involves not jumping to conclusions too soon and making predictions. It's about being curious and of noticing unusual things and holding them in your mind for a very long time sometimes as you start to see the patterns emerge. It's important to hold off judgment. I just loved his metaphor of curious things being the snags in the river of your mind. So poetic. I could totally visualize that. Also, I really enjoyed talking about businesses and the economy as an algorithm. Tim's belief is that capitalism does what we program it to. And businesses, especially marketplaces, can be very sensitive to the incentives we use to program them. That's how Facebook's algorithms have played a key role in our society being more and more polarized. And in our own businesses, we might want to think about incentives and the behaviors we want our stakeholders like suppliers and customers to have. And we might also want to consider encouraging our policymakers to set the right incentives to make the economy work better for everyone. And finally, Tim takes sides on the automation debate. He says automation isn't for doing the same things more cheaply. I guess I'll go on the record and say I tend to agree with him. The real successful companies will use automation to do things like reclaim production that's gone overseas and bring innovation local, or to free up labor to do more with less, not the same with less. But I wonder if I'm being Pollyannish. Not all companies will recognize the opportunity to do better, probably because of the incentive structures that Tim mentioned. And regardless, in the process, there will be pain as the workforce adjusts. What do you think? What trends worry you? And what trends are you excited about? Also, what do you think about Tim's comments about Los Angeles versus Silicon Valley? Give us a shout at team@artofmfg.com or on social @artofmfg. Now, before we wrap up, I want to ask your favor. If you're listening to this before 5 p.m. on June 29th, I would love for you to vote for Maker Walk. We have this amazing event last fall, behind-the-scenes look at studios and factories around the Arts District that we want to scale and replicate around the city and maybe even beyond. And we're now a finalist in the LA 2050 Challenge. We are eligible for $200,000 to enable us to do this. And so if you would, go to makerwalk.com. You'll get a link so that you can vote between June 19th and June 29th at 5 p.m. Also, you can sign up so that you can learn about our next Maker Walk in the fall. Thank you. Time to wrap it up for the Art of Manufacturing. Tune in next Thursday when we explore the taboo. What is it like to bring a product to market that most people feel really uncomfortable talking about? We speak with Julia Rose of Vagini and Melanie Crystal of Laurels. It's one not to miss. For show notes, visit www.artofmfg.com. Follow our adventures on Instagram and Twitter @artofmfg. And to chat with other like-minded creators, join the Art of Manufacturing Facebook group. Never miss an episode. Subscribe on iTunes or Spotify or your favorite player, and if you like the show, do us a favor and leave us a review. Or send us a message with your thoughts and ideas to feedback@artofmfg.com. This podcast is produced by At Large and Dangerous in collaboration with Make It in LA and other partners. Visit makeitinla.org/connect to sign up for local LA events and news. A big shout out to Peter Brandenburg, the producer and audio engineer. Thanks for listening to The Art of Manufacturing. I'm Z Holly, and remember, don't just make it, make it.